We are about to begin our first session of our beginning knitting series. And so today, the first thing we're going to be learning is our long tail cast on. Now the long tail cast on is one that is very versatile, and you will see it commonly used in lots of projects. The way you determine what to do with the long tail cast on is you need to figure out how much length of yarn you need to cast on for your stitches. There's kind of a rule of thumb on how to do this. Works mostly, primarily every time, but you take a length of yarn, probably about 6 or 8 inches, and one needle. And then if your pattern says to cast on 10 stitches, you would wrap your yarn around your needle 10 times. So let's do that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay. Now the way we begin is with a slip knot. And the way to make a slip knot is to make an E with your yarn. There's the E. Okay. I'm going to take this one, this end right here, and I'm going to tuck it under through the loop and pull it tight. The way I orient my yarn on my needles is I put my needle through the slip knot, tighten it up. This piece here is the tail. This piece is the one that goes to the ball. I'm going to hold the yarn in my left hand with my index finger and my pinky and my ring finger are going to be holding the yarn here, securing it. With my index finger and thumb, I'm going to separate the other 2 strands. Looks like this. I'm going to be pulling down and making a V, kind of a V with my needle, my thumb, and my index finger. With the tip of my needle, I'm going to go underneath the first strand, over the top of the second strand, grabbing the third strand, pulling it through. I'm going to drop my thumb and pull it tight on my needle. Okay, so let's try that one more time. I'm going to be grasping the 2 strands coming off my needle with my ring finger and my pinky. With my index finger and thumb, I'm going to separate those 2 strands, make a diamond like this. I'm going to come down with my needle. I'm going to go under the first strand on my thumb, over the second, grab onto the third one that's coming off of my index finger, tuck my needle down, and tighten it up. Okay, I have three stitches on my needle. We're going to continue to practice with that. I'm going to hold those 2 strands coming off my needle, separating those 2 with my thumb and index finger, pulling down, coming underneath the first strand on my thumb, going to the first strand on my index finger, pulling it through, and dropping it off. Okay, we're going to be casting on about 10 stitches, and then I'm going to begin by teaching you how to do the knit stitch. So bear with me while I cast on a few more stitches. Okay, there you go. There you have it. As you saw when I was casting on, the long tail cast on goes quite quickly. And once you become accustomed to the rhythm of how the yarn flows through your fingers, you will become very proficient at it as well. The way we begin knitting is by placing the needle in our left hand that contains our stitches. So we will be working the stitches off of the needle in our left hand and moving them to the needle in our right. You will be using the strand that comes off your needle that goes to your ball will be held in your right hand. Various people hold the yarn in different ways. It doesn't necessarily matter which way you hold it, as long as you're able to maintain a nice taut tension on your yarn. Some people wrap it around their fingers and hold it. Some people just grasp it with their fingers and are able to maintain tension. So I'm going to be picking up the needle in my right hand, and with the first stitch on the needle in my left hand, I'm going to take the tip of my needle and go from the bottom, this is the bottom, to the top of the stitch, but I'm going to be going out to the back. I'm going to make an X with my knitting needles. I'm going to turn this over so you can see that I'm going through that first stitch from front to back, okay? And I'm grasping the yarn with my right hand. I'm wrapping it around the tip of my needle, holding the yarn with my right hand, pulling my right hand needle through and off. I'm going to slip that off, okay? Let's try that again. I'm going to take the tip of my right hand needle through the bottom of the stitch on my needle, okay? Wrapping my yarn around the tip, pulling it through and off. Same thing. Tip of my needle goes through the stitch from bottom to top or front to back, wrapping my yarn around the tip, holding my yarn taut and off. Now if you'll notice, these stitches slide easily on my needle. You don't want them to be too tight because it makes it very difficult to get the tip of your needle into your stitches if they are too tight. Beginning knitters have a tendency to pull their stitches very tight for fear that they're going to fall off your needle. But it's actually better to relax. Hold your needle with a relaxed hand grip. First of all, your hands won't get tired. But second of all, your knitting will be a little more relaxed. And as we learn to become more proficient knitters, we'll learn more about gauge and what that means with a pattern. That won't be covered in this series, but in future series, I hope to be able to present a little more about gauge. Let's knit a few more stitches. The way to become a proficient knitter is to practice, practice, and practice some more. Try not to get frustrated and enjoy the process. It takes a long time to learn something new and for the muscles in your hands to learn exactly what you're wanting them to do. So be patient with yourself. Give yourself some grace. You're learning a new skill. So now I am turning around. I've knit all of the stitches off of my left hand needle onto my right hand needle. And now I'm going to be turning around and we're going to go back. So we've now traded needles. What commonly happens with persons who are now learning how to knit is when you turn around and are ready to knit back, this strand inadvertently gets wrapped over the top of your needle. Happens a lot, especially if you've laid your knitting down and are going back to pick it up. This happens quite often, and what it looks like is that this is 2 stitches, if you can see that. It does look like it's 2 stitches, but what's happened is your yarn has been wrapped over the tip of your needle, and you are actually looking at the stitch below that you have already completed. So the way to prevent that from happening, first of all, is to maybe give your yarn a little tug and make sure that when it comes off your needle, it is coming toward the front of the needle. Rather than, if I flip this over, you can see that the yarn is coming off the back of the needle. Okay? And so if you're holding the needle in your left hand and you look at the orientation of the yarn where it's coming off of the needle, it's coming around the front and out this way rather than over the back and out this way. Okay? What happens is if you were to assume that that was 2 stitches, you would be adding stitches onto your stitch count. And instead of having something that was nice and straight, your project would start to grow. All right, so we're going to start another row with some more practice knit stitches. I'm going to hold the yarn in my right hand. Tip of my needle is going to go into the first stitch. Front to back, wrap, tuck, and I can slide it off. Once you practice, you will become much more comfortable with the process of holding the needles, holding the yarn, getting your tension correct. So just take some time, practice casting on, practice knitting. And my last stitch, notice I'm holding it with my finger so it's not going to slide off. And I'm going to finish that last row. Okay, we have now knit 2 rows. A little bit about what knit stitches look like. If you'll notice, they're relatively even. And you'll notice these little bumps here are what we call purl bumps. And the way knit stitches look on one side looks like a little V. You can see that little V. I'll try and point it out to you right here. If I hold this down, this is the V of a knit stitch. Now, what looks like a knit stitch on one side, if I turn it over, you will see the bumps here, what we call purl bumps, on the back side. So on one side, a knit stitch looks like a V. On the reverse side, it looks like this as a purl bump, and vice versa. The purl bumps on one side, if I flip them over, would be a knit stitch V on the other. So that's what your stitches will look like when you are knitting and doing only knitting. As we start to look at our project for our headband, we'll be learning what it looks like to have where we alternate knits and purls, and the difference between a garter stitch and stockinette stitch. This is all terminology that you will learn in the process of the next few videos. So our next video, our next lesson will be on how to do a purl stitch, and then you get to practice. So practice, do some homework, and let yourself be comfortable with the knitting process.